Delighted to see so many of you come, so many familiar faces. Let me mention in particular, we have some of our trustees here. Gerhard Kasper is here, Hans-Michael Gießen is here, Regina Leibinger, thank you so much for coming. Lots of other friends. I noticed some faces that I saw last night from the award ceremony for the Bundeskanzlerin who got the Fulbright Fellowship Award. She gave a rather nice speech yesterday in which she said that these types of exchanges that the Fulbright does and that we do, bringing people together also brings countries together. And that's kind of a large part of what we do here at the American Academy, Germany and the United States. So tonight, to introduce our fellows of this season, we have Günter Sigler, who is the president of Freie Universität from just this past summer. Is also a math professor. And my brother is also a math professor, so I know not to go into the details of what he actually studies. It's something to do with discrete geometry and the theory of polyhedra, but I'll just leave it at that. But what I will say about Professor Ziegler is he's quite famous for being able to explain the complexities of mathematics in his own words. And he's been widely recognized for that. He got the Communicator Award of the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft and the Stifterverband für die Deutsche Wissenschaft for his ability precisely to do this, to explain the complexities of math to people who are not as gifted as he is in this particular science. And he also has this book. He wrote Das Buch der Beweise, which was translated, I think, into 14 languages. He wrote that with Martin Egner. And he won the Steele Prize for Exposition by the American Mathematical Society. So that puts him in a perfect situation to give us a short lecture on math, and then to introduce us to the fellows and introduce Berlin to the fellows and the fellows to Berlin. Professor Ziegler.
Thank you very much. I think you're setting the bar rather high, but I warn you, this is going to be a math lecture of some sort, and hopefully not the one you expect, so we'll be there. Dear fellows, dear distinguished guests, it's wonderful to have you all here and have the room so packed that I feel a little bit guilty for those who can't be that close. I hope that everybody can see a little bit of the screen at some point because I'll have a few pictures. Also on behalf of the Freie Universität, which I have the pleasure to lead now since last summer, it's a great honor and pleasure for me to give a keynote here at the American Academy and to welcome the new fellows for the spring term in Berlin. And so we can just declare this the beginning of spring, even if everything is relative, as we learned from Einstein, and even whether this feels like spring may be different to the people who have come from Chicago than those who've just arrived from Israel. The fact that I have the pleasure to welcome here the 42nd class of fellows, I mean 42 of course is a special number for all the mathematicians, but that part I won't explain to the others now, shows that the fellowship program is going strong and shows a certain continuity and power, and this I think is also a sign of quality of the institution to hold this. Looking back in history, we talked earlier about when history begins. History of academies probably starts with Plato's Academy, where the story goes, probably not true, that over the entrance of the academy it said that no one ignorant of geometry should enter. As a geometer, I think this is quite a reasonable criterion, but my understanding is that the American Academy doesn't really use the exactly same type of criterion even in the selection of the fellows. They describe the aim of the fellowship program to enrich transatlantic dialogue in the arts, humanities, and public policy. I think this is of enormous importance today and will probably get even more important in the future. I think we all feel that this mission is needed and necessary, so keep going. I today want to welcome you to Berlin in a way that's perhaps also interesting for everybody who already is in Berlin. However, as a mathematician, I have to be precise with definitions, so we have to start out with the question, which Berlin we are going to talk about. This is not just a rhetorical question, since there are at least 118 places on record on this globe called Berlin. Some only small villages, some reasonable towns. There's dozens of towns called Berlin in the United States. The biggest one in Wisconsin with about 50,000 inhabitants. The smallest on record in North Dakota with roughly 40 inhabitants, which you probably wouldn't call a town. So the Berlin I will talk about is Berlin, the capital of Germany, in which, or on the boundary of which we are right now, we find ourselves in, at least temporarily. This Berlin, if I have to choose, and all of life is about choices, as we know, this for me is my favorite Berlin, and for me it's the place to be, which also is a slogan that the agency who does the city marketing for Berlin calls this the place to be, and I think this is true. So today I want to present this city to you sort of in a rather perhaps individual and unconventional way, and I hope it will show to you that the city is actually pretty unique, not only among the 118 places on the globe called Berlin, but actually as a place on this globe. And this thing is supposed to be my welcome to Berlin. I call it the Berlin Countdown. So let us start with the first countdown. You may not be aware of the fact that countdown is something that was actually invented at some point, and you may even less be aware of the fact that it was invented basically here in Berlin, or at least close to Berlin, but close to this corner of Berlin, namely in Babelsberg, where Fritz Lang, the filmmaker, for his silent movie Frau im Mond, one of his last silent movies, did a countdown. This is it. So this is the first countdown. In a later interview, Fritz Lang explained that if you count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, 50, 100 or so on, then people would never know when it starts. But if he counts backwards, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 1, 0, then they would understand. The movie Frau im Mond premiered here in Berlin in Uferpalast am Zoo, now the Zoopalast movie theater, exactly 90 years ago on October 15, 1929. The premiere itself was an arts and science event, connecting arts and science. Actually, Herman Obert, who is one of the rocket engineers of the time, had not only been consulting to the movie, but he had also got third-party funds to start a rocket on occasion of the premiere of the movie. That part failed, but the movie worked. Why am I telling you this story? Because I think it tells the story of how arts and science and lots of other things interact here in Berlin and produce things that are unique and that bring things ahead. And actually everything connected to this movie at some point was also one of the starting points of various rocket programs and stuff. Some great, some not so great. I mean, Herman Obert worked with Werner von Braun to first get the V2 to London and later the Saturn V to the moon. Long stories, not our story today. But this is arts and science in Berlin. record is, so Wikipedia and Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung tell you that even Albert Einstein was at the premiere of the movie. I think it's probably not true, but if Wikipedia and FAT say it, who could deny that? Anyway, this is the rocket start in Berlin. 40 years before, in 1969, they really got a man to the moon. So this will also be one of the things to celebrate this year as an anniversary. Now, I want to do my countdown to Berlin, and I want to start it not at 10 and counting down, but starting at 3,700,000 to keep us going for a while this evening. 3.7 million is roughly the number of people in Berlin. It's the largest city in Germany by far. It's growing. It's changing. To me, who comes from a little village in the south called München, Berlin feels not only like a large city, but also like a changing city, like a dynamic city. The photo itself is Berlin Marathon. That's where you see a lot of Berliners and a lot of others on the move. Counting down, 175 is at least the number of museums and collections in Berlin. So it has been said that Berlin has more museums than it has rainy days, which might give you a suggestion of what to do on the rainy days, and perhaps even on others. And there's actually quite a number of quite amazing ones that you must visit. Just to mention a few, this is a photo from Museumsinsel, the museum island in the center of the city. The Lonely Planet calls it Berlin's most important treasure trove, spanning 6,000 years worth of art, artifacts, sculpture, and architecture from Europe and beyond. It's also one of Berlin's most expensive construction sites in the moment. They are rebuilding it. One of these artifacts is the Pergamon altar, which we cannot see this year, but there's still enough things to see. Another one is the Kulturforum with the Gemäldegalerie, the picture gallery, which holds one of the world's leading collections in European paintings from the 13th to the 18th centuries. And again, this is recommended. It's sort of, although it's a world-class museum without doubt, not enough people seem to know it. The recommendation is to wear comfy shoes when exploring the 72 galleries with about 1,500 paintings. A walk past the masterpieces covers almost 2 kilometers, which are worth the trip. Another highlight is the Jewish Museum, which in addition to its exhibition is particularly interesting in its architectural respects. Actually, there's people here in Berlin claim that the museum was even more amazing at the time when it was finished and could be visited, and there was no exposition in there yet. At that time, we had Sascha Waltz and her troupe doing dance performances in the empty museum. It's an amazing place. Daniel Libeskind, the architect, explained, I quote, "The new design was based on 3 conceptions. First, the impossibility of understanding the history of Berlin without understanding the enormous intellectual, economic, and cultural contribution made by the Jewish citizens of Berlin. Second, the necessity to integrate physically and spiritually the meaning of the Holocaust into the consciousness and the memory of the city of Berlin. Third, that only through the acknowledgement and incorporation of this erasure and void of Jewish life in Berlin can the history of Berlin and Europe have a human future." And I think actually this architecture does express this in various ways. I'm not going to run you through all the 175 museums, of course, but The German Museum of Technology is one that I should mention, where one of the things you can see is the computers designed by Konrad Zuse in 1941. Konrad Zuse, who's referred to as the inventor of the modern computer. Of course, the Brits and the Americans have their own heroes for these things, again, up to discussion, but Konrad Zuse had the working computer in Berlin 1941, and this museum has recreations and examples of his computers at the start of the digital age. To just mention my favorite museum, however, and this is also in my function of the president of Freie Universität, is that we have the Botanical Museum in Dahlem, Lichterfelde. The Botanical Museum is an amazing place. It's unique in Central Europe, has a huge herbarium and scientific library, the largest botanical library in Europe. And it has also the botanical collections, what's left of them, of Alexander von Humboldt's travels to South America, for example. And since we are celebrating Humboldt's 250th birthday this year, if you want to have some real Humboldt in your hands, basically, then you have to go to the museum there. These objects are there. They are quite amazing. I also recommend to visit the greenhouses. Among, if we talk about architecture, there's the Mittelmeer House, which is almost shaped like a cathedral and relates architectonically to the Gothic chapel of King's College in Cambridge, England. So that's an architecture reference to the Brits, who seem to be leaving us in some way in the moment. 175. Now, let's step down. The next one would be 9 in my numbers. 9 is the number of palaces that we do have in Berlin. Of course, in London, they have more. There's even more than 9 if you also count the various fortresses and manors. And if you add the castles around the city limits, then numbers go up. One that I wouldn't count is das Schloss, which is a shopping center in Steglitz district, and which definitely isn't worth the name. But just to mention the ones that you might know and that you might see at some point, there's the Charlottenburg Palace, Schloss Charlottenburg, which is the largest palace in Berlin up to now, and temporarily the residence of the Prussian kings. In the eastern part of the city, you find Schönhausen Palace, which served as the official seat of the German Democratic Republic President Wilhelm Pieck. There's, of course, there's the prison in Moabit, which I always, since I lived close to there, refer to as the last seat of the GDR government. But that's a different story. Close to that is Bellevue Palace, Schloss Bellevue, which is now the residence of the President of Germany since 1994, after the reunification, and which is closed to the public. So together with its sprawling white structure, you could call that one the German White House, if you want. Then there's the palaces in Köpenick, in Friedrichsfelde, in Glienicke, and in the middle of Grunewald, Jagdschloss Grunewald, worth a visit. The last two of them are only around 2 hours hike away from here, so if you want to get on your bike in the spring, that's possible. Finally, there is a small palace in Tegel, Schloss Tegel, which was built by Wilhelm von Humboldt. In the former building there, the brothers Wilhelm and Alexander von Humboldt spent much of their childhood. So again, a place to visit if you want to visit Humboldt. My favorite castle, of course, although the director tells me I'm not supposed to call it a castle, is what we nevertheless call the Schloss. It's the symbolic center of the German Empire after unification of Germany in 1871, was heavily damaged in the Second World War, demolished in 1950 by the GDR authorities, who then built what they called the Palace of the Republic, which is the parliament, on that site, which again was demolished after the reunification, to make room for a reconstruction of this Stadtschloss currently still being rebuilt with enormous efforts. The Stadtschloss will host the Ethnological Museum and the Museum of Asian Art under the name of Humboldt Forum. So again, you have Humboldt here. The opening is planned for the end of this year, and this here is how it is supposed to look like when it is finished. Already now worth a visit, an amazing structure coming up there. So that's the 9th one of these 9 palaces. I'll skip the 8 and go to the 7, which is for the 7 clusters of excellence that in the recent excellence competition in Germany were awarded to the Berlin universities. This is an interesting way of funding science that has been established in Germany in the last 15 years or so. These clusters of excellence are major collaborative research projects that bring researchers from different disciplines together to work on a promising topic. End of the definition. Berlin's major universities, Freie Universität, Humboldt Universität, and Technische Universität, together with Charité, won 7 of them. As a mathematician, of course, the mathematics cluster is close to my heart, which is, I think, an amazing structure and has a lot of power, and is also remarkable because, again, it's doing things together. It's 3 universities and 2 research institutes collaborating to advancing math and its applications in the world, but centered in Berlin. However, if I have to take my favorite of these 7 clusters, it may be this literature cluster called Temporal Communities. Doing literature in a global perspective is sort of the subtitle of the project. You might like it also because what it studies is what's happening here, namely a temporal community. And the claim is that we have to rethink, and they want to rethink literature history as not saying something that happens in nations and across ages, but it's something that happens when people come together. Research, to quote from their description, research will no longer be concerned with traditional notions such as the great poet and his works, but rather with literature's capacity for establishing communities across time. If you want to know more, talk to Anita Traninger and Andrew Johnson, who are both professors at Freie Universität and lead this project. Number 6 would be the number of United States presidents who gave public speeches in Berlin. In fact, all 13 US presidents since 1945 have visited Germany. Not all of them have come to Berlin, and not all of them who have come to Berlin have really given public speeches. So I can skip the current president, if I'm allowed not to comment at this point, and go directly to Barack Obama, who gave a speech as president in front of the Brandenburg Gate, the Brandenburger Tor, in 2013. So did Bill Clinton in 1994, Ronald Reagan in 1987, in front of the Brandenburg Gate, gave his famous Berlin Wall speech with Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. 1978, Jimmy Carter spoke at the Tempelhof Airport, where from 1948 to 49, an airlift was organized by the Western Allies to overcome the blockade of West Berlin by the Soviets. Richard Nixon spoke in 1969 in front of the Charlottenburg Palace and at the Siemens factory, stating to the Berliners that the people of the US are always with them, as are the people who are free and who want to be free around the world. However, of course, I'm doing all this direction only to arrive at John F. Kennedy, who, after his famous speech in 1963 at the Rathaus in Schöneberg, with this famous quote of Ich bin ein Berliner, which of course people in Berlin misunderstand because Berliner is a pancake, he came to the Dahlem campus of Freie Universität and I think gave an even more important lecture on the freedom of science. And if I'm allowed to quote from this, he said, "This school is not interested in turning out merely corporation lawyers or skilled accountants. It must be interested in turning out citizens of the world, men who comprehend the difficult, sensitive tasks that lie before us as free men and women, and men who are willing to commit their energies to the advancement of the free society." Today I would rework this and say men and women, or even women and men, but otherwise I think this is a very important statement. Number 5 would be my Berlin Pentagon, which is the Berliner Philharmonie in the Tiergarten district. The name derives from the unconventional ground plan in which 3 pentagons are sort of put into each other. You still find them in the logo of the Berlin Philharmonic. This concert hall, designed by Hans Scharoun, a professor at Technische Universität Berlin, was constructed in the early 60s. It has a singular design, asymmetrical and tent-like. With its pioneering architecture and its so-called vineyard-style seating arrangement, the terraces rising around the central orchestral platform, the building became a model for other concert halls, in particular the Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles. And if you want to see and learn more about that, I would recommend there's an exhibition right now at the Liebermann House next to Brandenburg Gate called Frank Gehry, Hans Scharoun, Strong Resonances, which has just been extended for you. I'm looking at the fellows. It will be open until February 10, and it's worth a visit with models, plans really expiring. Number 4 would be for the 4 universities in the city of Berlin. There's 4 that we really call universities officially in Germany, namely Technische Universität, Humboldt-Universität and Freie Universität, and the Universität der Künste, the University of the Arts. Now I'm somehow here lost in space, but I can do this. If you take these universities together, you have more than 100,000 students here in Berlin in about 700 different degree programs, so to a large extent this is a university city. You don't ask me for my favorite university among these 4, but of course Freie Universität comes to mind. It's a remarkable university because it was founded in 1948, just 70 years ago, basically as a student initiative. I don't know what universities around the world there are otherwise that are student initiative. At that time, students from the university in East Berlin who came away from the oppression there, these were students who were kicked out for writing things in student newspapers and who then decided there was supposed to be a new university in the Western and in the American zone. So the funding principles of Freie Universität, Veritas, truth, justice, and libertas, freedom, still were important then and are still important now. Without the support of the American people and administration, this foundation, this founding of this university would never have been successful. So Freie Universität owes to the international partnership to the United States, and this has always been and will always be of utmost importance. The building shown here is known as the Rostlaube for its exterior design. It's metal coated and it was supposed to be in such a way that this rust does not need repainting or anything like that, but would really give it a stable appearance. That's one of the things that haven't quite worked out. So it actually has been repainted since. The place where all of this was built, the central buildings of the Freie Universität, actually were an apple orchard until after the war. So I think we could collect universities that were built on apple orchards. I think Harvard and Cornell are some of these, so it's a good collection. Three, if you want, is three big active opera houses in Berlin that are certainly worth a visit. There's the Deutsche Oper. This one actually is not Deutsche Oper. Deutsche Oper is a 1960s building which was built to sort of house Wagner and still does mostly German Romantic operas. This picture is from is Komische Oper, but before that I wanted to say that Staatsoper unter den Linden is the oldest one, of course, from 1742. It's also important because of its perspective on cultural history. It recently reopened after very complex and expensive renovations. It has its focus on works of Renaissance and Baroque era, as well as the modern period. My favorite, if you want it, is the Komische Oper, which from the outside actually looks rather bare, but from the inside is a great place. And it's dedicated to a large extent to 20th century things. The director, Barry Kosky, has been bringing all these 1920 operas and things like that to the stage in a very wonderful way, worth a visit. Number two would be a little quiz question. The glass domes designed by Sir Norman Foster in Berlin. I guess everybody knows one of them, which is the one on the Reichstag, which wasn't there, of course, before the war, when this was quite different. So the building was redesigned and renovated after the reunification. By the way, the second largest parliament in the world, apparently, if this is right, where the largest one, of course, is in China with nearly 2,900 representatives, and where the German parliament in the moment has more than 700 representatives, which makes it a very large house and important and active and getting more and more interesting in various ways. The second glass dome by Sir Norman Foster, I don't know who is aware of that one, is sort of hidden behind the Rostlaube, which I had just shown you. It's the philological library of the Freie Universität. From the shape it has, so this is the outside and the inside view, you might understand why they call it the Berlin brain. It today holds about 700,000 books in a broad range of subjects in the humanities, from literary theory over English, German, and classical studies to philosophy and comparative linguistics. So feel free to visit. It's worth a visit. Actually, both of the domes are. And finally, getting to number one, just to present to you a new project here in Berlin, which is what keeps the university landscape busy in the moment. The three big universities, including their medicine, which is Charité, decided to start jointly as the Berlin University Alliance in this competition going on in the moment called Excellence Strategy. And we have joined forces to find answers to complex, pressing questions together across the boundaries of individual disciplines and institutions, drawing upon the high density of research and teaching institutions in the region, and by cooperating closely with the numerous non-university research institutes, museums, collections, and industrial partners in the city. Our goal is to establish Berlin as one of Europe's leading science hubs of knowledge and research. I'm giving this description to you also because this is an invitation. It's an invitation to do science and to do things in Berlin together. In this case, it's the three universities sort of as driving forces, but trying to realize this potential that's here in the city with the universities, with the museums, the collections, everybody in Berlin. It's one big city, and I think the city is so exciting because things come together. The proposal for this Berlin University Alliance was submitted under the title Crossing Boundaries Towards an Integrated Research Environment, was submitted in December to the authorities. Review will be end of February, so you might feel some of the vibes of everybody being excited and most people being nervous at the end of this month. Anyway, the decisions will come only in July, so there will be the tangents will stay there. In this sense, welcome to Berlin. I can just conclude with an invitation to get to know and also be a part of this city, of this thriving and thrilling city, which also caught me at once as soon as I came here in 1992, some time ago. I can assure you, coming from Bavaria to the former Prussian capital, this really means something. So in that sense, welcome to Berlin. And now I'm excited to hear about your projects for Berlin and here in Berlin. And Lucy Raven will be the next on the podium. Thank you very much.
Hi. Okay. My name is Lucy Raven. I'm the Ellen Maria Gorison Fellow, and I'm very happy to be here tonight. And I'd first like to thank everyone at the American Academy for having me, especially the incredible staff and, of course, the other fellows who I've already enjoyed getting to meet this first week. I'm greatly looking forward to spending time with you all and getting to know you more while here. I'm an artist. I live in New York, though I'm originally from Arizona, and investigations of landscapes and materials, natural, industrial, and recycled, run through much of my work. I teach film and sculpture at the Cooper Union School of Art, and my own work is primarily grounded in animation and the moving image, although I also work with sculpture and installation. Often the connection between those areas for me is via the physical and built landscape. I'm interested in material histories, economic, political, and infrastructural systems, as well as in the rich histories of the mediums I work in, particularly film. Here in Berlin, I'm working on two main projects. The first is a permanent public artwork for a new museum of the Bauhaus, currently being built in Dessau, about an hour outside of Berlin. Dessau is the site of the famous Bauhaus school and is where many of the movement's most important buildings are sited, but it has never had a dedicated museum. On the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Bauhaus School in 1919, a new museum is being built by the Barcelona-based firm González Hin Zabala. My work, called Leakesville House, literally light play house, and also an older German word for cinema, is an installation of overlapping colored glass panels, 5 meters high, moving on a rail system and conceived for the building's lower level. I see the piece at once as a kinetic color study, an ever-changing abstract animation, a customizable projection surface for film, and a backdrop for performances. Its concept draws on a number of key Bauhaus histories and pedagogies and pedagogical objectives, while also using new technologies to reimagine those ideas in relation to the present and foreseeable conditions of the museum, its collection, and the city of Dessau. The second project is a film called Fatal Act, which I'm making with my production collective 13 Black Cats. The film is structured around a 1950s-era real-life correspondence between Günter Anders, a German Jewish philosopher and critic of technology, and Claude Etherly, the American weather pilot who gave the all-clear signal to drop the atomic bomb over Hiroshima. We'll be filming with actors, and excitingly, I'm casting for the role of Anders here in Berlin. We'll be shooting on location in Utah in April at the Enola Gay hangar in the barracks of what was, during World War II, the largest U.S. military airbase, inside a barracks where Etherly would have lived. Several months into their correspondence, Etherly, who was interned in the psychiatric ward of a military hospital in Texas, racked with guilt over his role in the dropping of the bomb, wrote to Anders to say he'd been approached by Bob Hope to make a biopic of his life, and he wondered which actor should play him. Anders warned Etherly against this, saying that to engage in this sort of Hollywoodification of his life would turn him exactly into the hero he did not want to be, that indeed this would be the most fatal act of his life. But he tells Etherly that perhaps another sort of film could be made, and this is where our film takes off. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Peter Holquist. I'm a professor of modern Russian and European history at the University of Pennsylvania. And this spring term, I'm the Axel Springer Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. Like Lucy, I want to open by thanking the director and the wonderful staff for all they do to make our time here productive, and also to the donors and supporters who have made it possible for us to be here. I want you to cast your minds back 3 or 4 years, and then 10 or 20 years to the Russian invasion of Crimea and eastern Ukraine, and then American invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, and how the debates about those invasions were cast in terms of who is a legitimate combatant, those little green men. Can we consider the Taliban prisoners of war, a legal category? How should an occupying army conduct itself? What rights and obligations does it have? What rights and obligations does an occupied population have? The terrain of this debate takes place upon a conceptual space that was created in the late 19th and early 20th century with the establishment of the international law of war. Before that, there had, of course, been usages of war, what was called the law of nations. It's in a series of congresses and conferences in the late 19th century that you produce positive treaty law, the international law of war. This takes place at several conferences, and there is a curiously precocious player in the story. It is Imperial Russia. By illustration, it was the Russian imperial government which convenes the first conference to discuss the codification of the laws of war. In Brussels in 1874. This will be the topic of my fellows seminar on February 13th. Or again, it was the Russian government which convened the Hague Peace Conference in 1899, not only convening it, but as the convening power having to distribute the materials for discussion. So Russia's role here is not simply diplomatic muscle, but there's actual intellectual contribution. Or finally, in the middle of the First World War, it was the Russian government that initiated and drafted the Entente Note to the Ottoman government on the ongoing Armenian genocide, invoking for the first time in a penal sense the term crimes against humanity. I want to examine this Russian role, and I do so along 2 tracks in my project by right of war. The first track takes the form of intellectual and diplomatic history. It examines why the scholars of international law in Russia were interested in codification, and especially the codification of the laws of war, and why Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs decided to deploy these scholars to congresses and conferences to pursue this project. It's a nice thing to talk about these ideas, to establish these new norms. How do you make it real? The second track of my project examines whether there's any traction to these new norms by asking whether the Russian army observed these norms in a series of military occupations. The first case is Russian conduct in the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78, 3 short years after the Brussels Conference. The second case is Russian conduct in the Boxer Rebellion, less than 6 months after the end of the Hague Peace Conference. The final case is Russian conduct in the First World War and the occupations of East Prussia, Austrian Galicia and Bukovina, and Eastern Anatolia of the Ottoman Empire. I don't ask whether international law made war less violent or less possible. I ask how it shaped the parameters of violence. So why Berlin? Well, first I need to make an observation that I've arrived here after 5 months at the Helsinki Collegium, so indeed Berlin seems in January quite balmy and sunny. I've done all the research that I've needed in the sites of Imperial Russian archives, Tbilisi, Tartu, St. Petersburg, Moscow. What I hope to do here is turn a Russian story into a more European story. So I'm interested in the role of the British delegate at the Hague Peace Conference, who in 2 months convinces his government to change decades of resistance to codified international law, or to ask about the conduct of the German military in the Boxer Rebellion in comparison to the Russians. I look forward to ongoing discussions that have already started and have been very productive with my colleagues, but also to discussions with my colleagues and fellow scholars here in Berlin and throughout Germany. Thank you again.
Good evening. My name is Jared Farber. I'm a professor at the State University of New York. Originally, I'm from Utah. I'm privileged to hold a fellowship named in honor of the late Anna Maria Kellen. Everyone here is the recipient of her generosity. I honor Frau Kellen's memory and offer gratitude to the extended Kellen-Anhalt family. I also thank the staff of the Academy who are, in a word, superlative. I study environmental history, a discipline that sounds better in German, Umweltgeschichte. I'm writing a book called The Survival of the Oldest, the Past and Future of Ancient Trees. In May, here at the Academy, I'll give a public presentation. This evening, to introduce my project, it seems fitting to reference, who else? Alexander von Humboldt, whose 250th birthday Berlin celebrates this year. Looking back on his youth, Humboldt identified three things that awakened in him an inextinguishable longing to visit the tropics. They were a book, a painting, and a plant. The plant was a colossal dragon tree in an old tower at the Botanical Garden in Berlin. On his first outbound trip to the Americas, Humboldt stopped in Tenerife, where he saw an even more colossal dragon tree. He measured its dimensions and pronounced it one of the oldest inhabitants of the globe. Humboldt joined a modern quest to create a global inventory of age-dated trees. Using the tools of German forestry, American scientists in the early 20th century invented dendrochronology, the applied science of tree rings. Along with ice cores and lake sediments, tree rings became essential data for reconstructing past climates and modeling future ones. But age-dated trees are more than just containers of data. Ironically, secular acts of instrumental science have sacralized trees. Throughout the modern world, nations have given strict protections to trees whose venerableness has been advanced by scientists. In this way, the modern history of science circles back to a much older history of sacred trees and pilgrimage sites. Humboldt intuited this. He used the term Naturdenkmal in reference to American trees. He drew a connection between the ancient veneration of great trees and the modern care given to the numerical determination of their ages. One kind of care led to another, Naturdenkmalpflege, the care of natural monuments. The book I'm writing tries to answer three questions. What's the oldest known living thing? How do we know? And why do we care? In political terms, I'm investigating the problem of long-term thinking and caring in a time of intense novelty and rapid global change. Because ancient trees are the ultimate locals, and because they bridge the gap between historical time and geological time, they're vital to the emotional dimension of climate politics. It's heartbreakingly easy to imagine their collective demise in a worst-case climate scenario. It's harder and more important to imagine a changed Earth and a changed world where caretaken things might still grow old. Thank you.
Thank you. Could I get some water, please? Thanks. Hi, I'm Ann Finger, and I'm the Holtzbrink Fellow. And like everybody else, I'm just amazed at the generosity and the care that's gone into creating such a wonderful place for us fellows. I actually have another mic on here, so we thought of that ahead of time. We do have this wonderful podium that goes up and down. So I'm from Oakland, California, and I'm not finding this weather balmy, I have to say, but I'm hopeful that it will warm up a little bit, and these trees around here will get beautiful buds on them. And I love being in Berlin. So the project, I write both fiction and nonfiction, and the project that I'm working on here is a collection of personal essays, disability onto the, oops, I think I'm hitting something here, mapping disability onto the geography of this city. And I was inspired to do this when, on previous visits to Berlin, when I saw the stumbling blocks that I'm sure you're all familiar with, that mark the places where Jews lived who were deported and murdered. And I wondered what it would be like to have a similar kind of, because I'm a writer, not a visual artist, but to have a similar way of coming upon the history, the disability history of Berlin. So I'm kind of at the beginning of my project. I'm wandering around the city and seeing what happens, so I don't 100% know what I'm going to do. But I am struck by a quote that's very widely used in the disability studies field from Douglas Baton, who said, "Disability is everywhere in history once you start to look for it, but remarkably absent in the histories that we write." So some of my essays are going to look at historical figures, everybody from Rosa Luxemburg to Joseph Goebbels, who themselves had disabilities. Others are going to explore literary figures such as Franz Bieberkopf, the central character in Alfred Döbling's Berlin Alexanderplatz, who becomes disabled partway through the novel and then ends at the end of the novel in the Buch Insane Asylum. And I'm planning to visit that asylum. I think we're actually going to do a podcast of my visit there. And I'm fascinated by abandoned spaces. It's now an abandoned space. And on the internet, you can see pictures of it. And I can imagine the eerie silence of the courtyards and buildings, which once resonated with footsteps, wheels of carts, carrying linens, foods cooked in distant kitchens, vials of camphor and dextrose for treatments, moans of pain, solemn conversations, a manic shout of exultation at the wonder of life. And then from talking about that asylum, I'm also going to talk about the history of what happened to mental patients, both in the euthanasia program and also at the end of World War I, where many people did starve to death. Many patients starved to death. And in my talk, which is going to be on March 12th, I'm going to be talking about Joseph Goebbels' disability. Goebbels had a club foot, and that phrase, club foot, is used in just about every description you can find of him. And I'm kind of interested in just that phrase as managing to sound both kind of violent and primitive at the same time, and how that emphasis, that focus on Goebbels' disability is a way of not looking at some of the maybe deeper issues we need to look at with Nazism, not seeing some of the connections between U.S. anti-Semitism, U.S. eugenics, and some of the things that happened in Germany, that we turned Goebbels into this twisted, crippled, evil figure. Disability is often assumed to be a site solely of suffering, and I'm also going to explore the joys of disability community and the joys of difference. And I'm going to write about the annual Disability and Mad Pride Parade that happens here in Berlin. So thank you, everybody.
This goes up, doesn't it? Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Fred Donner. I'm a professor at the University of Chicago in the Oriental Institute and the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, where I teach mostly the history of the medieval Islamic world, sometimes medieval Arabic texts, and so on. I'm honored to be a fellow here this spring and to be the Nina Maria Gorison Fellow in History at the Academy. And before I go further, I'd like to echo the sentiments of my predecessors in thanking the Academy for having me here, but also in thanking the wonderful staff of the Academy, which has made our lives really enviable. And all their efforts to support us are much appreciated. My goal in Berlin is to study, identify, and study documentary Arabic papyri from the 7th century of the Common Era. That is, documents written by members of the earliest Islamic community. Islam, the religion inaugurated by the Prophet Muhammad, began in the first decades of the 7th century, and within 100 years, the Islamic community had come to control much of the Near East, from Spain and North Africa to the Indus Valley. We have a rich traditional picture of how this all happened, but it is drawn from the Islamic literary tradition, Islamic sources written in Arabic, compiled for the most part several centuries later, mostly in the 9th and 10th centuries, not the 7th century. The traditional picture can be expected, since it is later, to be somewhat idealizing, to tell us not what had actually happened in the 7th century at Islam's origins, but what the later community wanted to believe had happened, or wanted us to believe had happened. So these sources include things like chronicles, biographical dictionaries, genealogical works, and so on. In particular, the later sources depict Islam as already a clearly defined religious confession from the very beginning. Above all, they depict it as being distinct from the two precursor monotheisms, Judaism and Christianity. But some evidence suggests that at first the community started by Muhammad had closer or maybe even symbiotic relations with Jews and Christians, and that there was early on a kind of fluidity in communal boundaries. This more open communal definition tends to be denied by the later sources. So my goal in Berlin is to examine some of the documentary Arabic papyri from the 7th century, which might tell us what really happened. I plan to explore the large number of Arabic papyri held in the Neues Museum, in the papyrus collection there, where, if I'm lucky, and I hope to be lucky, I may find some yet unidentified 7th century papyrus, letter or other text. I'll also spend some time this spring editing early fragments from the holdings of the Austrian National Library in Vienna that I identified some years ago. This work will, I hope, contribute to a more accurate picture of just how Islam began and what the nature of the first Islamic community's relations to Christianity and Judaism may have been. I'll be glad to talk further about this with any of you who may find it of interest in the reception to follow our talks, or at my lecture, which is coming up this Thursday, January 31. Thank you for your attention.
From the plague to Ebola, infectious diseases have long struck fear in the hearts of us humans. Inasmuch as their deadly consequences, what makes disease so uniquely terrifying is their mode of transmission, passing via virtually invisible pathogens across even tightly policed borders. And yet, while disease does not respect political boundaries, the boundaries that we find ourselves within have determined our vulnerability to an infectious disease. So why have places with similar epidemiological and socioeconomic conditions had very different levels of success in the control of contagion? My name is Prerna Singh, and I am going to be working on this book during my fellowship at the American Academy. This is the central question of the book. In real life, when I am not in this magical world here at the Academy and in Berlin, I teach at Brown University, where I'm the Mahatma Gandhi Associate Professor of Political Science and International Affairs. So most prominent explanations for the control of contagion emphasize the invention of and access to health technologies. And yet, the more critical challenge today is that of societal uptake, of getting people to accept these technologies. Only last week, the WHO, the World Health Organization, cited vaccine hesitancy, the reluctance or refusal to vaccinate despite the availability of vaccines, as one of the top 10 global threats in 2019. So the key question for me is, why are health interventions accepted by people in some cases but met with skepticism and even opposition in others? In my book, I approach this question by following the trajectory of the world's first ever vaccine, variola vaccinea, which gave rise to the very term vaccine itself. It was targeted against and it led to the eradication of smallpox, what many medical historians cite as the deadliest disease to afflict humankind and the only human disease that we have to date been able to eradicate. Polio is hopefully the second. So specifically, I compare the differences in the popular uptake of this first vaccine in cities, in provinces, and the countries of China and India through the 19th and 20th centuries. And based on these historical comparisons, I argue that the popular uptake of a health technology hinges critically on the way in which it's communicated. Effective communication has two components: a message that needs to motivate and a messenger that needs to be seen as legitimate and trusted. Social psychology tells us that as humans, we are much more comfortable with the familiar. We have an easier time accepting new information if it aligns with our established ways of seeing the world. A health technology such as a vaccine is accordingly more likely to be accepted when it is integrated within rather than seen as a rejection of received understandings and regimens for a disease, and when such a culturally embedded understanding is broadcast by an institution that is seen as authoritative. So in my lecture on the 19th of February, I developed this argument through a comparison of the cities of Canton and Calcutta in the 19th century. And I show that vaccination had far greater popular acceptance in Canton because it was described as working according to existing theories of traditional Chinese medicine, and the entirely foreign practice of an incision into the skin was justified in terms of acupuncture. The local gentry broadcast this sinicized version of vaccination, thereby lending it a stamp of authority. So my research as a whole focuses on understanding and proposing innovative solutions to contemporary challenges to human well-being, and I'm therefore specially honored and grateful to have been named the Bosch Fellow in Public Policy here at the Academy. Within the field of public policy, my research is somewhat unusual in looking to the past to addressing the pressing social questions of today. In my first book, How Solidarity Works for Welfare, I showed how contemporary differences in education and health outcomes in India and beyond can be explained by historic differences in the strength of nationalism. So while my presentation here at the Academy will be based largely on archival material, I will conclude by thinking about how this might allow us to think differently and creatively about key challenges, including that of vaccine hesitancy that are confronting us today. Thank you.
I guess this is as high as it goes. So, I'm Jesse Ball. Sort of, you could say I'm a novelist. That's one of the things that I do. I'm here to claim the Mary Ellen von der Heyden Fellowship. Another way of saying that would be to say that I'm claiming to be the fellow. If someone else stands up and claims to be the fellow, we can have an argument. There's a sort of dilemma that I had about this speech, which is, I guess I'm to talk about the project that I'm going to do. In fact, it's impossible for me to speak about a work that I'm going to do prior to doing it. It would leech the life out of it. So I thought, rather than do that, I would share with you some impression that I have about what writing is to me, what a book is. So I'm going to try to do that. Well, a book, especially a novel, but really it applies to all books, is a kind of photograph of the mind of the writer. It's a study of the mind of the writer. This is a very lucky thing for any writer because we can be the authority on our own mind, at least, if on nothing else. For me, the experience of being myself, walking around, I pretend to be a person. I pretend to be the person that I am. And I try to feel a continuous effect of that. Although I know that I'm not actually this person continuously, I pretend to be in order to speak to you, in order to speak to other people, in order to love, in order to be angry, be indignant, especially maybe. But at times in my life, I turn a corner in a street, I sit down on something sharp, who knows what it is. I have an impression that the general philosophy that I'm acting under is incorrect. It's not a proof of it, just an impression that possibly I'm just entirely wrong about everything. And there's more to the world than the working system with which I construct the world that I operate using. And so we reach the second question, which is what is a book? Or I guess it's the first question. What is a novel? Well, a novel about a boat is not really a novel about a boat. It's, as I said, a snapshot of the mind. So when you read a really great book, the book provides a kind of an experience of the person's mind who's writing it. My goal in writing the books that I write, and sometimes it's been successful, sometimes unsuccessful, is to, in the simplest possible terms, give the feeling of the experience that I have. The performance of writing is my attempt technically to provide for you the experience of being myself thinking about something. And in the process of thinking about that thing, the world cracks or fractures or bursts. More of the world is then admitted to me than previously. The system that I use is shown to be a fallacy. And I hope that in the book, in the text of the book, that progress, that mental progress is given to the reader, and that he or she can then have a little company, perhaps, in how ridiculous life is. So I'm going to talk more about this. I'm going to give a talk, I guess, later in the semester. In closing, the word fellow often has adjectives appended to it in English. Good fellow is one, or good fella. Another one is bedfellow. I guess we're all bedfellows here. But my personal favorite is poor fellow. And I think we poor fellows are a bit like house plants. You know, we need light and water and maybe some Mozart and some of the things that the American Academy provides for us. So this house plant is grateful. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Jennifer Allen. I'm an assistant professor of history at Yale University, and I have the pleasure of holding the Bertold Leibinger Fellowship this semester at the Academy. So I am a historian of 20th century Germany, which means my work has often brought me to Berlin. And over the course of doing research, Berlin has transformed from the subject of my work really to a place that feels a lot like home. So it is a delight to be here. Where I've actually been working since June with the very generous support of Professor Dr. Paul Nolte, who I just saw somewhere in the crowd, and who I would just like to acknowledge briefly. Of course, I am also delighted to be here at the Academy. My fellow fellows have already heaped praise upon the wonderful staff and wonderful other fellows, and so I will just echo all of that. So this spring, I am starting a new project, the foundation for my second book, which is called Insurance Against Total Destruction, a post-war history of German plans to save the world. So I'm a historian who likes writing sanguine histories, and there's actually a lot to be sanguine about in 20th century Germany. Especially post-war, Germany became a model of economic prosperity, of political stability, of continental, arguably global leadership. Still, people start to get a little nervous when you put Germany and plans for the future of the world together in the same sentence. This topic evokes associations with violence, of course, Nazi violence, but also the violent messianism of state socialism. I try to approach this theme a little bit more neutrally, though, and explore how the three post-war Germanys, so West, East, and reunified, reimagined the pillars of humanity and civilization after the war, and how they tried to protect them. I think there's no better avenue for accessing interpretations of what really matters than through discussions of what is worth saving in the event of catastrophe. And there are a lot of inroads into this theme, but I'm most interested in responses at the state level. And what I found are two fascinating and very different answers. In West Germany, in 1961, so same year the wall goes up, as Cold War tensions are at a height, a group of government officials, intellectuals, archivists, they developed a plan to protect the building blocks of German culture in case the originals were destroyed as a result of nuclear destruction. And their solution was to assemble a collection of microfilmed images of the most important pieces of German patrimony. So peace treaties, religious documents, musical scores, etc., sources of pride, but also sources of shame and sort of everything in between. And they housed this collection in an old silver mine near the French-German border. And over the past half of a century, the Central Recovery Archive, as it's called, der Zentrale Bergungsort, has grown to nearly 1 trillion images. This is the largest archive of its sort in Europe, and it gives us one answer to the question of what matters after disaster. So I hoped to find a kind of analogous project in the East for comparison. Unfortunately, I came up mostly empty-handed. And the story here, it could really stop there. It could just kind of tell a history of the marginalization of national cultural heritage within the international project of socialism. But that's what we might call a kind of dog bites man history, a history that we expect. We expect that Germany's second dictatorship, its failed experiment in state socialism, we expect that it didn't bequeath much to the post-Cold War order that's worthy of commendation. I'm interested in man bites dog history, however, the thing you don't expect. In the East, there was no equivalent to the Central Recovery Archive, but there was an effort to create a similarly massive archive of a completely different sort when a group of researchers set off to develop an agricultural gene bank of international renown. And they understood their growing collection of millions of seeds from around the continent as the safekeeper of nothing less than the genetic future of Central European agriculture. It became arguably one of the best collections of its type in the world and a defining feature of the East German research landscape. And it offers a completely different answer to the question of what's worth preserving. So my book follows the development of these tandem stories through the present, importantly including the gradual sort of cross-pollination of Eastern and Western investment starting in the 1970s, which makes this project a kind of exciting example of Verflechtungsgeschichte, or the history of the entanglement of the two Germanys. So I will talk more about this project on May 16th, but if you'd like to hear more about my previous previous work, I'm part of a panel discussion on the Stolpersteiner Holocaust Memorial Project, which Anne mentioned. That's on February 21st at the Gedenkstätte Deutscher Widerstand. And whether tonight or in February or in May, I would love to talk with you more if any of these themes interest you. Thank you.
Am I close enough to this? Good evening. I'm George Frampton. This spring I'm fortunate to be the inaugural Richard Holbrooke Fellow here at the Academy, a new fellowship honoring one of the central founders of the organization. And I think on behalf of all of us, I should thank all of you for coming to hear us and for supporting and hopefully continuing to support this remarkable and important, perhaps increasingly important organization. My work has been primarily in environmental policy and environmental advocacy, running a national environmental organization in the U.S. at one time, the Wilderness Society, as a public official for 8 years in the Clinton administration, as a lawyer representing wind and solar companies, helping to get big projects financed and permitted and built. Most recently in the private equity space, clean tech space. Probably all of you are pretty familiar with how tremendously polarized the climate change issue has become, politically polarized in the United States over the last roughly decade. What you may not appreciate is that in the last 6 to 8 months, and particularly since the November election, this may seem ironic in light of our current president's view about climate change, but there's been a real beginning of a shift, increasing interest and pressure from the public and from the business community, pressing for the United States to finally face up to developing a real comprehensive national climate change policy of some kind. Now, that's going to take legislation. That means it's 2021, a new president, a new Congress before this can be actually achieved or move forward in a concrete way. But in the meantime, it isn't very clear exactly what the shape of this policy can be to attract broad public support. Because over the last few years, the political community and the climate community in the United States haven't spent a lot of time thinking about that. There hasn't been any reason to. There was no chance that Congress over the last 4 or 5 years would take this up. So my program here is intended to allow me to try to learn as much as I can from the trajectory of EU climate policy, 10, 12 years now being implemented in several phases, and the future, the debate about how to strengthen that policy from 2020 to 2030, to learn what I can that's useful for us in the United States. Germany's obviously the perfect place to do this because it has so many issues that are central to the policy debate. Traditional reliance on coal, a big chunk of nuclear, raising the question of what the role of nuclear power is going to be in a climate-changing world. A lot of leadership in subsidizing wind and solar, but then electrical prices go up. Like the U.S., a very powerful and advanced, and I would say economically and politically powerful automobile industry, which is important to all of this, but in Germany it may be that industry made a strategic error over the last 10 years that may have to be compensated for in ways that aren't clear. And finally, what you do have in Germany and the EU, which we don't have in the United States, is the support, or at least the acquiescence and support, of large segments of the business community to actually develop a sensible, predictable, long-term economic policy that deals with decarbonizing the economy as well as growing it. That support basis, that platform is not there right now in the American business community. And it will be essential, as we've seen recently in Canada, where Trudeau has adopted a carbon tax proposal because of the support of the oil and gas and pipeline and financial industries. This will be very important in the U.S. So one of the things that I particularly want to do while I'm here is not only talk to think tanks, nonprofits, NGOs, people in the government, but people in the business community to see how it is that this happened here over the last 10 years and whether there are lessons we can learn in the United States. And I'm going to give a talk here February 27. I'm also going to be helping organize in late May a day-and-a-half workshop in downtown Central City with some Americans and Germans to try to focus on this issue and the comparative challenges over the coming year or two for the EU versus the US in developing its climate policy. So thank you for being here.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Emily Apter. It's a special pleasure to be spending a term at the Academy, in my case as the Daimler Fellow. Besonderen Dank, many thanks to such an engaged group of staff and to the colleagues whose presence promises to make my time here productive and unforgettable. In addition to finishing a book titled What is Just Translation, that interrogates the transmedial limits of what translation is as a set of linguistic and aesthetic practices, as a system of laws that inflects institutions of authority and penitentiary culture, and as a problem of naming race, political status, and gender identification across languages, I'm taking a rest from chairing the Department of Comparative Literature at NYU, where I've been teaching in the departments of Comp Lit and French since 2002. One of my goals in coming here was to immerse myself in the cultural life of Berlin, and I hit the ground running with a conference at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt on Das Neue Alphabet, the new alphabet. And thanks to Bernd Scherer and his team for organizing that wonderful event. He might be here. I don't see him. While I'm here at the Academy, I'll also be speaking at the Institute for Cultural Inquiry, the Zentrum für Literaturforschung, Literary Research Center, the Freie Universität, and, of course, the Academy itself. My presentation here on April 11th, it was going to be on another topic, but I've been urged to do sex and translation. Maybe that will increase the audience. And it will examine how difficult it is to transpose concepts like trigger or gender violence or sexual safety into different national languages and across cultural contexts. My project at the Academy builds off previous work on the politics of translation. I wrote a book that dealt with untranslatability in the teaching of world literature, and my colleague and friend Martin Puchner, who's here, he and I will be continuing to have those exchanges. I did another book on translation as a language condition in war and military zones. Throughout, I've foregrounded the precarious position of the translator, often an unseen language laborer whose roles include those of interpreter, stringer, diplomat, and all-around mediator of public discourse and the circulation of ideas. An abiding interest in philosophical translation led to work editing the English translation of Barbara Cassin's monumental Vocabulaire européen des philosophies, Dictionnaire des intraduisibles, which we published in English under the title Dictionary of Untranslatables, a philosophical lexicon, 1.5 million words, 500 entries, a torture of a project. How do you translate the untranslatable? This was a seemingly impossible task, but it led to productive pedagogies and collaborative ways of working. In my own usage, untranslatables are identifiable within what we might think of as a lexicographic turn in theory today, by which I refer to the contemporary critical preoccupation with graphology, digitality, data management, dictionary rubrics, and encyclopedic knowledge objects. The English untranslatable, used unconventionally in our title as a substantive rather than as an adjective, is itself a kind of misnomer grafted from the French term l'intraduisible. For Cassin and our team of translators and editors, it involved imagining a history of terms or words rather than keystone concepts that become philosophical by virtue of their transit in and through languages. So it's not an encyclopedia of philosophy in the normal sense. It's really what happens, the distortions that happen through terms that travel and are mistranslated, continually retranslated, or simply carried over from their original language into another one, like Dasein, Begriff, Aufhebung. We often use those terms in English, at least in philosophical contexts. So you could say here that remnants of idiom and dialect are given their due as formative material for epistemology, metaphysics, and cognition. At a moment when digital languages, drawing on AI, algorithms, and blockchains, are blurring distinctions between natural languages and code, this problem of how to call the matter of thinking, or even how to think about translation, takes on renewed importance, and it sounds like some of what Professor Ziegler's research teams in the literary field are doing coincide here. Against the backdrop of translation in an era of digitalization and shifting knowledge alphabets, I'll be experimenting with a political theory of translation. What do I mean by this? Well, where translation studies traditionally focuses on standards of formal and semantic equivalence, I shift attention to measures of equality and justice. An obvious example involves taking stock of how the dominant languages of international finance and education, English, Spanish, Mandarin, Swahili, affect so-called minor language communities, those with smaller economic and demographic footprints. So questions arise. What are the new orders of sovereign monolingualism? Is plurilingualism on a path to extinction? How do we deal with the great game of languages in the global economy of cultural exchange, the aesthetic public sphere, including publishing outfits, art fairs, world exhibitions, and biennials? How do configurations of language and power map onto the denomination of regional cartographies and area studies? Big questions. I'm not proposing to answer them all, but they form this backdrop to what I would say is a principal impetus of the book I'll be working on here, which is to define translational injustice under conditions of violence and legal disputation. These conditions are analyzed in cases with contemporary political resonance, including gender violence and sexual safety, the incommensurateness of terms like refugee, migrant, étranger, Ausländer, settlement, detention zone, or camp. Another area, accent tests administered as a form of linguistic passporting on asylum seekers, the scripts and soundtracks of police raids. In this last case, what is spoken may be less important than what is heard and not heard. Here one could say, translation studies meets sound studies. With this in mind, while in Berlin, I'll not only be working on translation as a medium of justice in the laws, I'll also be listening hard, trying to become attuned, and last but not least, learning German. Drückt mir die Daumen.
The good news I have for you is that I'm the last speaker. I'm also a professor of English and comparative literature at Harvard University and delighted to be the John P. Birkeland Fellow here at the American Academy. The transatlantic mission of the Academy is dear to my heart since I grew up in Germany, even though I've spent most of my adult life in the United States. My work originally focused on 19th and 20th century literature and culture, but then about 15 years ago I became the general editor of a massive anthology of world literature that started with the invention of writing and somehow 6,000 pages later ended then in the late 20th century. And that experience really blew my mind. It in more ways than one, it attuned me to the importance of big picture thinking. So questions like when and under what circumstances was writing first invented? In how many parts of the world was it invented independently and under what circumstances? What are the broad shapes of different literary traditions and what happens when they interact and collide? So that became a recent book called The Written World, The Power of Stories to Shape People, History, and Civilization. And in that book, I tried to move breezily through 4,000 years of literature, but very much grounded in an experience we all share, namely that we are living through an unusual revolution in writing technologies, and I think we can all feel how fundamentally that is changing our society. So what I try to do is look back into literary history and ask what happened at earlier moments when new technologies changed the shape of the written word. Technologies like the invention of paper in China, or the first invention of print in China, second invention of print, of course, here in Germany, the invention of papyrus, parchment, and the alphabet. So trying to draw lessons from history for our own time, as several of my fellow bedfellows are also trying to do. So this is what I'll be talking about in my Academy talk in April. And since we started with rocket ships, I might mention that I begin and end the book with Apollo 8, not because it led us to the moon, it didn't, but it was the occasion what I consider the first literary reading in space. This is actually not my Academy project. I'm working here on a Corkier project, a history of a secret language, an underground language, a thieves' language that was spoken in Central Europe, a combination of German, Yiddish, and Hebrew, very obscure language that I know about because I grew up around it and learned it from my uncle. And in researching this, I found a hidden history of my family that included everything from Nazi historians to members of my family dragged before the Nazi judge Freisler. It involved the documents of the Nuremberg trials and much more. Since I won't be speaking about this here, I'd be happy to teach you a few words from this secret language over drinks, which I believe are awaiting us next door. Thank you.
So given the advertisement of the drinks, I need to move breezily through my final remarks, to borrow a term. I have to first mention there are three fellows who aren't with us tonight for various reasons. Herman Mark Schwartz is Professor of Politics at the University of Virginia. He's one of our two Bosch fellows in public policy. He's an economic historian. He'll basically be looking at the economic factors underlying the growth of populism and nationalism, which is a very relevant topic for our current situation here in Europe and in the United States. Our second fellow who isn't here, Ronald Rodano, he's a professor of African Cultural Studies and Music at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's going to be our spring 2019 Andrew W. Mellon Fellow in the Humanities. And he will be focusing on the colonial era African recordings of the phonogram archive at Berlin's Ethnographic Museum. And finally, we have a composer and pianist, Wang Lu, who's currently stuck in visa hell, trying to get a visa, which is somewhat challenging at the moment. She has a Chinese passport. She lives in Chicago. This is too long to explain. Anyway, she's going to be our Inga Maren Otto Fellow in Music Composition when she gets her way out of the vortex and arrives in balmy Berlin. She writes music inspired by traditional Chinese music and urban environmental sounds. And here she's going to be working on a composition inspired by Chinese replicas of iconic European towns and landmarks like the Eiffel Tower, Parisian boulevards, and Florentine bridges. So let me first thank all our fellows for their wonderful presentations and have whetted our appetite for what I know is going to be a very interesting semester. I should thank Professor Günter Sigler for giving us just one out of 118 Berlins. The other 117 he will deliver separately. And I thank you all for coming, and I invite you to join us for some wine and some good conversation in the adjoining rooms. Thank you so much.